The advertisement had been folded so many times the crease had worn through the paper. She kept it anyway. It said, "Sheep operation, Northern Alberta. 1 man, 200 head, no debts. Looking for a capable woman, room, board, fair arrangement." It did not say lonely. It did not say the roof had a problem or that the dog was old and half blind. She found those things out herself. She arrived on a Tuesday in late April when the ground was still half frozen and the melt ran in dark channels along the road. The man who met her at the station was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. He was somewhere in his 50s, lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they're busy, with a stillness about him that she recognized. It was the stillness of someone who had learned not to make requests. He said, "You're the one who wrote." She said she was. He picked up her bag before she could and set it in the back of the truck. She noticed he hadn't asked which bag was hers. They drove for an hour without much talk. The land opened out to the north and west, flat at first, then rolling, the sky wide and colorless in the way of early spring before anything had greened. She watched the fence lines, the condition of the wire, the way the posts sat in the ground. Some had heaved from the freeze. Several needed replacing. She noted this and said nothing. When they turned up the drive, she counted the sheep she could see from the road. 43. Given 200 head, the rest were either in the barn or somewhere she couldn't see yet. But 43 visible on a clear afternoon was not a number that came from a well-managed operation. Sheep that were healthy and settled spread out. Sheep that were cold or hungry or sick kept together. She asked which pastures he'd been rotating them through. He glanced at her. "Same one since my father's time." She nodded, said nothing else about it. The farmhouse was stone and wood, well built in the old way, the kind that had been added to rather than replaced. The kitchen was the warmest room and the cleanest. She understood then what kind of man he was, one who maintained what mattered and let the rest go. A boy named Corbett worked the farm with him, young, maybe 19, with a knuckle that had healed badly from some old break. He shook her hand without meeting her eyes, the way young men did when they weren't sure of something. He disappeared into the barn after supper, and she heard him moving about in there for a long time after dark. The man showed her the room at the end of the hall. There was a window that faced east, a hook on the back of the door, a quilt on the bed that someone had made a long time ago. "Breakfast is early," he said. "That's fine," she said. He finally left her to it. She had grown up on a sheep operation in Manitoba, her family's place on the edge of the valley, where the wind came down from the north in November and didn't ease until March. Her father had taught her to read a sheep the way some men read a newspaper. For information, for what it wasn't saying. Her mother had taught her to keep her own counsel. She had been married once, briefly, to a man in Winnipeg who worked for the railway. He was not unkind. He simply had no idea who she was, and she hadn't known how to tell him. When the child she was carrying didn't survive the winter, something between them that had been fraying pulled apart entirely. She left in the spring. She did not leave a note because anything true enough to write would have been too heavy to leave on a kitchen table. She had worked since then, on a farm near Lacombe, a sheep station outside of Red Deer, a winter at a feed operation near Drumheller, where she learned more about nutritional management than she'd learned in the previous decade. She had been good at all of it. She had not been unhappy, but there is a difference between not unhappy and settled, and she had not yet found the second thing. She had circled the advertisement 3 times before she cut it out. By the end of the first week, she had walked every pasture. The land was good, better than she'd expected given the state of the flock. The soil in the lower sections held moisture well. There was a creek that ran from the northeast corner of the property, fed by snowmelt, which would run strong until June and then slow. But along the south-facing slope, where the ground was higher and drier, she found something else. There had been a spring there once. She could tell by the way the vegetation grew. A seam of different grass, greener, thicker, running in a line that didn't follow any surface logic. Grass didn't lie. Where there was water underground, even silted over water, even water that hadn't broken the surface in years, the roots found it and the grass told you. She dug with her hands at first, then with a spade she borrowed from the tool shed without asking. 8 inches down she hit mud, dark, cold, river-smelling mud. She went back to the house and found the man at the kitchen table going over a bill from the feed supplier. She said, there's a spring on the south slope. It's been silted over. Maybe 10 years, maybe 20. If you cleared it, you'd have another water source that runs independent of the creek. He looked at her over the paper. She said, I can show you where. He said, I know where you mean. A pause. My father used to water a different flock there. She waited. I thought it was gone, he said. It isn't, she said. He set the bill down. All right. They spent 3 days digging it out together, she and the man, with Corbett helping in the afternoons when he'd finished the barn work. The spring came up slow at first, reluctant, and then with more confidence, and by the third evening, there was a clear trickle running south along the old channel. She watched the man stand at the edge and look at it for a long time without speaking. He said, My father dug this with a post-hole digger and a prayer, she said. The water remembered. He looked at her then in a way he hadn't before. Not appraising, not uncertain, something else. Like recognizing. By June, the pasture rotation had changed. She had drawn it out on paper at the kitchen table one night after supper, using the man's survey map and a pencil, showing him the grazing sequence that would let each section rest properly before the flock came back to it. She explained about compaction, about root depth, about what overgrazing did to the soil structure that took decades to undo. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Both were good ones. He said at the end of it, My father managed this differently. She said, The land is different now than it was in your father's time. Less rain most years. The soil can't recover the same way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Fair enough. Corbett was easier by then. He had started asking her questions in his sideways manner, looking at the fence post or the ewe he was examining rather than at her, and she answered in the same register, straightforward, no ceremony. She learned that his family was from a reserve near Peace River, that he'd been working for the man since he was 16, that he was saving to buy his own land someday. She said, Sheep or cattle? He said, Probably cattle. Sheep make me nervous. She said, Sheep make everyone nervous. That's part of it. He almost smiled at that. In July, 2 ewes came down with foot rot. She caught it early because she'd been watching a particular ewe favor her left foreleg for 3 days before the signs were obvious to anyone else. She trimmed and treated them herself, isolated the pair, checked the others twice daily. Neither one was lost. The man came to the barn on the 4th evening and watched her work and didn't say anything until she'd finished. He said, You've done that before. She said, More times than I'd like. He said, I lost 4 to it 2 years ago. Didn't catch it in time. She said, You catch it faster when you know what to look for. He said, I suppose you'll show me. She said, I already have been. He paused, then nodded slowly. There was nothing else either of them needed to add to that. By September, the flock was in better condition than it had been in years. The man said so, not to her directly, but to a neighbor named Scully, who came by one afternoon to look at a ram he was interested in purchasing. She heard him through the barn wall. He said it plainly, without flourish. She turned them around. She went on doing what she was doing and didn't say anything about it later. Scully stayed for coffee, and she heard him ask the man, through the kitchen window she'd left open, how he'd managed to find someone who knew sheep that well. The man said, She found me. That was all. There was a woman in the nearest town, a pharmacist named Vivian Sark, who had taken it upon herself to be curious about the arrangement. She came out to the farm twice in the first month on invented errands. Once to return a casserole dish that apparently her mother had borrowed, once to drop off a seed catalog that had been mailed to the wrong address. She was not unfriendly and not dishonest. She simply wanted to understand what she was seeing. She asked, on the second visit, how long she intended to stay. She said, I don't know yet. Vivienne Sark nodded in that way women nod when they've decided not to say the thing they're thinking. She drove back to town and she didn't come again. The question of what they were to each other stayed unspoken well into October. It was not uncomfortable. There were evenings when they sat in the kitchen after supper, he with the accounts, she with whatever mending or records needed doing, and the silence between them was of the kind that doesn't require filling. She had not known many silences like that. It was its own form of thing. He made good coffee and was willing to make it twice if the first pot sat too long. She took note of this. She had started checking the accounts herself, not because he asked, but because she noticed an error in the feed billing. a duplication across 2 months. And when she pointed it out, he said, "I've never been good with figures, in the way of someone confessing something that cost them something to admit." After that, she looked things over when she could. The numbers told a clearer story than he had in that original advertisement. The operation had been running close to the edge for several years. Not failed, but close. A hard winter in the wrong year, a bad lamb season, a disease that moved through the flock unchecked, and the whole thing would have tipped. She looked at the figures for a long time one evening, and then she put them away and went to bed and lay there thinking. In the morning, she told him she had some ideas about the spring lambing operation. She told him she thought they could increase the flock by 30% over 2 years if they managed the breeding carefully, sold a portion of the clip directly rather than through the co-op, and brought the pastures back to the fertility they'd been at before the soil compacted. She told him what it would cost and roughly what it would earn. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because it's your operation." He said, "You know it isn't. Only that." She looked at him. "I mean, if you're planning to stay, I'd like to know if you're planning to stay." Outside, a wind had come up from the north. She could hear it in the eaves, the particular sound of a structure that was solid enough to stand against what came at it. She had been listening to this house for 6 months, and she had decided it was the kind that didn't complain about the weather, only registered it. She said, "I'm planning to stay," he said. "Then it isn't only my operation." There was nothing romantic about how he said it. It was simply true. She understood this was the form that honesty took in a man like him. Not declaration, but plain acknowledgement of what was already the case. She said, "All right." He nodded. Neither of them said anything else about it that evening. But when she came down the next morning, the coffee was already made, and there was a second mug set out on the counter beside it, and she understood that this, too, was a form of language, and that she was learning it. The winter was hard in the way of Alberta winters, which is to say it was serious and it expected you to be serious in return. The pipes froze twice, a ewe delivered prematurely in January, and the lamb was small enough to fit in both of her hands, and she sat up with it for 3 nights in a row in the kitchen, near the stove, while the cold pressed against the windows. The lamb lived. It was not a remarkable lamb, not especially quick or hardy, but it had fought hard to get here, and she thought that counted for something. Corbett took on more responsibility through the winter, and she taught him everything she knew about pregnancy toxemia and hypothermia in newborns, and the subtle signs that separated a ewe who was managing from one who was not. He was a quick learner, and he understood instinctively that animals told you things if you paid attention, which was the hardest thing to teach and could not be taught to someone who didn't already believe it. In February, he asked her, one morning while they were sorting feed, whether she thought he'd be able to manage a small operation on his own someday. She said, "I think you'll manage a large one." He looked at her sideways. She said, "Not right away." But eventually, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know if I'll ever have enough saved." She said, "There are other ways besides savings. Keep your credit clean. Keep your records. In 5 years' time, I think you'll have more options than you're imagining." He nodded slowly in the way of someone filing something away carefully. She went back to the feed. After a moment, he did too. In March, a neighboring operation, the Quennell place, 15 kilometers east, came up for sale. The man heard about it at the feed store in town. He came home and told her over supper. She said, "How much land?" He told her. She said, "What's the water situation?" He told her that too. 2 licensed wells, no creek access, but surface rights to a slough that filled well in wet years. She thought about it. She said, "It depends on the pasture condition. If they've been grazing it hard, we'd spend 2 years and real money getting it back." He said, "I was thinking the same thing." She said, "When could we look at it?" He said, "I called Quennell this afternoon." He said, "Whenever we want." She noticed the we. She let it stand. They drove out the following Saturday, both of them, and she walked the land the way she always walked new land, without rushing, without conclusion. The pastures had been grazed too hard. The slough was smaller than it had been a decade ago. She could tell by the ring of dead sedge at the high water mark. The fencing was old, but the structure of the land was good. Good bones, she thought, and then almost smiled at thinking it about land the same way you thought it about a house or a sheep or a person. She told the man on the drive back what she thought. He asked her questions. She answered them. By the time they reached home, they had the shape of something, not decided yet, but visible. The offer went in the following week. By the second spring, the combined operation ran 460 head. She managed the breeding records and the health protocols and the pasture rotation across both properties. The man managed the equipment, the fencing, the business relationships with buyers and suppliers. Corbett ran the daily barn work, and the young man they'd brought on in November, a quiet Métis boy named Arsenault, who'd grown up around horses but was learning fast, handled the feeding and the flock checks in the evenings. She did the accounts herself now. She had a system, a ledger for each property, a summary sheet that combined them, a projection page she updated every quarter. The numbers had stopped being alarming and started being, if not comfortable, at least comprehensible. She could see where they were going. One afternoon in May, she found an old newspaper clipping in the back of the filing drawer, dated 11 years earlier. It was an article from a regional agricultural paper about the operation. A short piece, a paragraph really, about the recovery of a spring-fed water source on the property and what it had meant for production. The figures quoted were wrong. Modest, she thought. Whoever wrote it had underestimated. She took a pencil from the cup on the desk and corrected the figures in the margin. Then, she folded the clipping and placed it at the front of the current ledger, in the section where she tracked what the land had been and what it was becoming. Not for anyone else. For herself, and for the record, and because she had learned a long time ago that the true account of a thing was worth keeping, even when no one thought to ask for it. Outside the window, the flock moved across the south pasture in the long early light, and the spring that had come back ran cold and clear along the old channel. And she sat at the desk and watched it for a while before she went back to work.